Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Angela Rasmussen. I am coming to you today from the same place that I come to you from every day, my home office. But I have a few programming changes to make. This show was conceived initially as a sort of co hosted daily update that would be in addition to the show that Jessica Malati Rivera and I normally run called Taking Shots, which is on Tuesday and Friday afternoons. And it's super fun, and you should join us. However, a daily show where I make marketing materials and we have a whole plan to do everything in a very timely manner just really isn't working out because both of us are incredibly busy experts on Ebola virus outbreaks. And guess what? That's happening right now. We're also experts on disinformation and a bunch of bullshit that the government is doing in terms of global health policy and why it's bad. So we're also being kept pretty busy by that. So I've decided that we're just going to change this show up a little bit. And I used to be the associate editor of my college newspaper, the Smith College Sophian. This is a picture of Smith College, by the way. Love Smith. Go Pioneers, now Bears. Anyhow, as part of this, I had a column in the paper, a weekly column called Angie's Weekly Rant. It was very good because I was able to use that column to just go off on whatever was bothering me. And boy, when I was like 21 years old, a lot of things bothered me, some of which were different from the things that bother me now as a considerably older middle-aged woman. Any hoodles, I've decided to have this show be called Angie's Daily Rant. So that way I don't have to make any marketing shit for it. And basically, I'm just going to hit go live whenever I have some time to do it, usually in the mornings. And anybody who happens to be on all the social media platforms can tune in and see what's upsetting me today in the world of global health and the rise of fascism in America and abroad. Today, what's going on? Well, I'm sure you've been hearing me go off on Kenyan Ebola prison, which is the facility that Secretary of State Marco Rubio, in collaboration with the Public Health Service Commissioned Corps and the Department of War, is planning to deal with any American who might have been exposed to Ebola while responding to the Bundabugia virus outbreak that is currently occurring in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Uganda. So to just give you a quick update on that situation, it's really bad. Okay. So Director General of the WHO, the World Health Organization, Tedros, is in Ituri province in the DRC, which is really the epicenter of all of this. This outbreak has been going on at least for several months. There are now more than 1,000 suspected cases. Test positivity is extremely high. Now, there aren't enough diagnostic tests being done. There's still a lot of issues because essentially the entire outbreak region is also a conflict zone where an ongoing civil war has been taking place. And that has really, really hampered the response. Of course, the other thing that's hampered the response is the US's withdrawal from the World Health Organization, as well as the US cutting all funding for the US Agency for International Development, or USAID. Cutting USAID, as well as the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, has deprived people primarily in Africa, but throughout the global South, of necessary HIV medication, of vaccines, and of critical infrastructure that normally would have played a key role in responding to this Ebola virus outbreak. So what we're seeing really is the consequence of a failed response that I think much of which can be placed squarely into the US's lap in terms of responsibility. So this is something that, has been very, very frustrating and concerning for me and many of my colleagues. And boy, has the US's plan to address this made it just even worse. So yesterday, the White House had a press conference to talk about what their plan was going to be. So they want no people with Ebola at all coming into the US. That would ruin the World Cup. It would totally ruin America's 250th birthday party. In case you didn't realize it, there's going to be a big MMA throwdown at the UFC Octagon that they are building on the White House South Lawn. So there's a lot of really important stuff. Of course, Trump's also going to have a big Soviet-style military parade where we get to, look at what our taxpayer dollars have supported in terms of buying ordnance and various military vehicles. That will, I guess, be paraded through the streets of Washington, D.C., much like Joseph Stalin did after the Soviet Union won World War II, thanks to our help. Anyhow, back to the plan. So Secretary of State Rubio got Kenya's Minister of Health and the president to agree to allow the U.S. to set up a tent hospital, a field hospital, effectively, on an Air Force base in Kenya, in central Kenya. Any American who has been in the DRC, in Uganda, in South Sudan, in Rwanda, and any of the countries that have been singled out and targeted by the travel ban that the U.S. issued will not get to go straight back to the U.S. and stay at home for symptom monitoring, which has worked very well in the past with people returning from other Ebola outbreaks, such as the West African epidemic in 2014 to 2016. We didn't have any U.S.-based transmission of Ebola virus for any patient that was taken into what are called biocontainment units. So these are specialized hospital facilities at various hospitals throughout the United States. We've invested over $1 billion in building these things out so that patients who have been exposed to a virus like Ebola, who get a virus like Ebola, who have Ebola virus disease, can be cared for and get the best care in the world at no risk to the healthcare workers who are helping them, and at no risk to the community. And we, in fact, for every patient that was treated in one of these BCUs, these biocontainment units, they all survived. And there was no onward transmission of Ebola to any of the healthcare workers taking care of them or to the outward community in the United States. So in the past, we've actually dealt with people returning from an Ebola outbreak zone. We've been able to take care of them very well, and we haven't had any spread of Ebola to our country. Now, the U.S. just doesn't want to do this because, again, Ebola, we don't want Ebola people coming in, even if they are Americans. Now, for me, as an American, if I were abroad and I got freaking Ebola, the first thing I would want to do is come home and be able to be taken care of in my own country with the best experts in the world, using the resources that my tax dollars paid for. But that's not what Americans are going to get. Here's what your tax dollars are paying for. The U.S. has said that this is going to be a great option. Sorry about that. As usual, my production skills are getting in the way of me. I was looking for the news layout. Here we go. Okay, this is the Department of State's plan for responding to this. Now, they say that this facility in Africa, in Kenya, is going to be just as good as everything in the U.S., and they're investing all of this money into it to make sure that this is just as good as anything that they could get back home. Except I don't see how that's possible. So I am not a physician. I will put it this way. I have never responded to an Ebola outbreak. I don't treat patients. I am a scientist who works in a lab and knows how these viruses work. But I do work in a containment lab. So I do know a few things about making sure that I don't get Ebola when I'm working with it, and making sure that anybody else doesn't get Ebola or any of the other pathogens that we work with in containment labs. So there are very specialized procedures, and containment labs are purpose-built for this exact reason. There are engineering controls. That's what we call them. That means the building itself is actually built to specifications to make sure that a pathogen can't get out. This is really, really important. And this isn't something that you can just stand up overnight in a tent. This means things like specialized airflow handling. How are you going to exhaust the air? If it has pathogens in it, you can't just vent it out into the atmosphere. You need to filter it or incinerate it or do something else to disinfect it before you are actually exhausting that air. You need to make sure you can have negative pressure in the containment space. That means that when, if there is some kind of lab leak, nothing can get out of the room. You need to have positive pressure suits for people, healthcare workers, to wear. This is a suit, one of those space suits. And the reason why they're inflated is if you get a hole in that suit, the oxygen, the air that's circulating inside the suit is pushing out of the suit, so nothing can actually get in. You will also be able to detect that tear in the positive pressure suit because you will be able to sense it. You will be able to hear actually that there is air whistling out of a crack or something. You can put a piece of duct tape on it and fix it. So, none of that is going to be in place. Like those positive pressure suits require being hooked up to actually an airline. You can't just make a negative pressure space in a tent, not very easily. And you can't make one that's going to be as good as a facility, a brick and mortar facility that has been built for this exact purpose. Now, the U.S. Army and Secretary of State Rubio and the Public Health Service Commission Corps, which is one of the uniformed services, so they are also part of the U.S. military, are the ones who are going to be standing up this facility. And while it is true that the U.S. military has a lot of experience doing this kind of thing, they set up a lot of Ebola treatment units in West Africa, for example. They can get to a place where they are needed and set up this infrastructure fairly quickly, but not in a week. I mean, they are claiming that there's a 50-bed facility that is ready to go like right now. And I just don't see how that is possible. They just found this Kenyan Air Force base, got Kenya to agree to let them set up this janky ass field hospital. And now they're saying that eventually, at some point, they're going to have 3 isolation units. So just in case any of those high risk exposure patients coming back from responding to the Ebola outbreak happen to pop positive for Ebola, they'll have a nice little isolation unit that they can put them in. And then also they've said that they're going to send them to Europe. Now that's all well and good. I mean, they've already sent the Americans one American has tested positive for Ebola and others are in quarantine, and they've sent them to Germany and the Czech Republic, where they do have great facilities. I would feel perfectly fine myself if I were being treated at Charity Hospital in Berlin. Some of the best virologists and physicians and infectious disease doctors in the world are there. They have specialized facilities for this purpose, but it's not home. It's not America. I don't want to go to a foreign country if I get Ebola while I'm trying to help contain an Ebola outbreak. I want to go back to my home country where I can use the resources that my tax dollars have paid for to take care of me. And that's not what's going to happen at this facility. But my biggest concern about this facility is the more I think about it as an expert in biocontainment and biosecurity, that this facility is a disaster waiting to happen. So picture this. You've got 50 Americans who are all coming back from DRC and Uganda from treating Ebola patients in Ebola treatment units, which, by the way, are tents and are pretty conducive to Ebola spreading between the patients. In fact, this happened quite a bit. For this reason, a lot of people did not want to go to an Ebola treatment unit if they had Ebola or symptoms of Ebola. And some people had to actually be taken there forcibly. In some cases, they weren't going voluntarily because there was so much fear. And you can imagine this. I think this is a very human thing. If there's an Ebola outbreak occurring and you suddenly get a headache and a fever, boy, I mean, are you going to immediately be like, oh, well, I guess it's donezo for me. I've got Ebola now. No, I think that probably a very normal human response would be, can't be Ebola. I have malaria. That must be what it is. I don't want to go to one of those Ebola treatment units where it seems like a hellish experience. I'm going to be socially stigmatized for it and I might die. And what if I don't have Ebola? I might get Ebola there. So this is not an ideal solution for treating people. The only reason that these Ebola treatment units are used is because there's not really any other option for taking care of a bunch of Ebola patients all at once. Especially in places where there hasn't been that infrastructure build out and that infrastructure investment. And that's one of the situations that the people in DRC are going to be facing. They are going to be dealing with Ebola treatment units, which also is the US's contribution. They claim that they're going to build 50 of these ETUs. That took them years, by the way, when they had 3,000 active duty Army members in West Africa. These things are not trivial. They are not regular tents that you can stand up, but they still are tents, and they are not as good as the hospital facilities that we have invested $1 billion in. Now, Americans, though, who are coming out of DRC and out of these Ebola treatment units from treating patients and responding to a humanitarian emergency, will be imprisoned essentially at this Kenyan facility. and they will be kept in what seems to me like congregate living facilities where they will be monitored for symptoms of Ebola and tested regularly, presumably. They've said, the State Department says that they have monoclonal antibodies, which, by the way, there are no approved monoclonal antibodies for Bundabugia virus. So I guess you're just going to be using some monoclonals that won't hurt, but they won't work either because they're made for a different species of Ebola virus. There will also be remdesivir, which hasn't been shown to be effective in clinical studies, also causes some kidney problems. Ebola itself causes kidney problems. Many people, because of the coagulopathy, the disorder in blood clotting, have problems with their kidneys function. So often they need dialysis, and you're going to give them a drug that doesn't work, or at least it hasn't worked so far in any of the clinical trials it's been tested in. It hasn't been tested against Bundabugia virus. So I guess there's that. But, are we going to test it on people, on Americans, just because they've got an Ebola virus that we don't have any medical countermeasures for? So you're just going to throw the kitchen sink at them and hope something works. But you're also going to be keeping them in a congregate facility with at least 50 beds, with isolation units that are not going to be built to adequate containment standards, because how can you do that in a tent? It's going to be pieces of plastic, probably. Maybe it'll be a separate tent. I have no idea, because they didn't give any details at this press conference or in this press release. So, all of this to me is kind of a big problem, because it sounds to me an awful lot like we don't have adequate containment standards. We don't have adequate protections for the healthcare workers who are going to be dealing with the people who are in quarantine. And if one of them gets Ebola, everybody else in that facility is going to be at a huge risk of also getting Ebola, because the two primary drivers of Ebola during Ebola virus outbreaks are healthcare workers, or people who are caring for sick people. So family members, nurses, doctors, first responders, anybody who is helping to take care of a sick person, and funerals. So contact with dead bodies, undertakers, people attending funeral services in which they are touching or having contact with the body, or having contact with family members of people who had been taking care of that person when they were alive. So this is basically creating an ideal environment for spread of Ebola virus from one of these Americans to other Americans, including active duty service members who are going to be operating this facility. This is going to happen on foreign soil in another country. People won't have access to their family members. They won't have access to the quality of care and the expertise and the facilities that they would have at home in the US, despite our track record of never having an Ebola outbreak that stems from this. But this is all based on fear and political decisions rather than any kind of concrete or substantive science. And that is really my problem with it, because in order for us to have a Ebola-free summer, I guess, we are going to condemn Americans to being imprisoned effectively in violation of their 14th Amendment rights to due process and their citizenship rights. And we are going to incarcerate them in this Ebola death trap, where not only are they at risk of having substandard treatment for Ebola, everybody else in that facility is going to be at risk of getting Ebola. Everybody in Kenya at this Air Force base is going to be at risk of having that outbreak expand from the US facility into the Kenyan Air Force Base and potentially out into the community. By the way, there are no cases of Bundabugia virus in Kenya right now. Kenya is actually kind of a long ways away from DRC. It's not like their neighbors, and this is just a quick little flight. Africa is a big place, and Kenya is not that close. So we are actually putting Kenya at risk of starting an Ebola outbreak there. If this happened, it would be a lab leak from the American military and the Department of War and the Public Health Service Commissioned Corps. I have some experience with lab leak rumors, and they're not true, but people were sure mad when they thought that Chinese scientists did this with potentially some assistance from the former director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, Tony Fauci. People thought that was horrible. I wonder how people would think it's going to land when the US military causes, for exclusively political reasons, an Ebola outbreak in a foreign country by putting a bunch of different Americans at risk from dying from Ebola. To me, this doesn't seem like a solution that protects Americans in any way. It doesn't protect their health. It doesn't protect their constitutional rights as Americans. And it certainly doesn't protect a policy in our democracy where we're making decisions based on evidence rather than the whims of our political leaders. And in case anybody hasn't been paying attention to what Donald Trump is like, forgive me, but I don't have a lot of faith that he's on top of his game in terms of objectively evaluating the evidence for what makes an effective Ebola virus outbreak response, for minimizing the risk to Americans. And I'm not sure that that's his priority either. In fact, I think it's kind of not. Well, America might be screwed, but at least Kenya has some sense, even though the US basically did its usual thing of shaking down Kenya thanks to these bilateral agreements we've basically extorted everybody into signing. The US is going to give Kenya a measly $13 million to improve their own quarantine facilities. And they're going to invest, like $100 million or something. They've said they're going to put a lot of money into the Ebola response, which means this janky facility. So a Kenyan court, people in Kenya were not happy about this decision. They did not approve of the Trump administration setting up this Ebola factory basically on one of their Air Force bases. So people immediately took it to court. And today, a Kenyan court has ruled that this facility cannot go forward. Now, that theoretically is good news, but I don't know anything about the Kenyan court system, and I'm going to talk about somebody who might have some more insight into this in a little bit. But I don't know anything about the Kenyan court system. I don't know if this is the end of it, but I will say that I don't think that this means that the U.S. is going to reconsider their plan to have a foreign Ebola prison. I think this actually means they're going to do something probably even more dangerous and more stupid. So we'll wait and see what's going to happen with that. But this is something that really, really concerns me and a lot of my colleagues, both in terms of the erosion of our civil rights and in terms of the huge risk that this presents to Americans in terms of their Ebola risk. So a group of colleagues and I, led by Casey Hickox, who was a nurse who was deployed to West Africa, and upon her return, there was a lot of paranoia about Ebola at the time. And Governor Chris Christie of New Jersey basically enforced a quarantine on Casey, where she had to live on the tarmac at like Newark Airport for a protracted period of time because nobody wanted to have, Ebola. She didn't have Ebola. She was imprisoned without due process rights, effectively on the tarmac at Newark Airport for a couple of weeks, which is totally unacceptable and also unnecessary. Because if you look at somebody like Craig Spencer, who did get Ebola while he was treating patients in Guinea, he came back to the US. The New York Post made a big deal about this because he went bowling in Brooklyn. I remember doing press at the time where I was like explaining that you couldn't get Ebola from sharing bowling shoes or like using somebody else's bowling ball, and like they disinfect stuff and whatever. So stupid. But Craig was doing home monitoring. He was monitoring for symptoms multiple times a day. He felt fine, and Ebola doesn't get transmitted until you become symptomatic. As soon as he became symptomatic, he went straight to the biocontainment unit at Bellevue Hospital, where they saved his life, and nobody got Ebola, including his girlfriend, fiance, who he was living with at the time, now his wife, and they have a couple of kids together and are very happy. None of them got Ebola because we know how to prevent Ebola transmission when people, use evidence. We have some experience with this. People use evidence to make infection control policies, to make home monitoring and quarantine policies. You want to do this in a way that respects people's rights and human dignity and their health, of course, but you also want to do it in a way that's going to keep everybody else safe. And we know for Ebola that because you are not contagious before you get symptoms, home symptom monitoring actually works fine when you can go straight to a biocontainment unit and get the treatment you need should you test positive or develop symptoms. So a group of us led by Casey Hickox, as well as civil rights lawyers for Casey and for the passengers on the MV Hondius, who have had hantavirus exposures and are now currently being imprisoned essentially by the US government in Nebraska at the biocontainment unit there. At least they are in a BCU. So if any of them do end up getting hantavirus, everybody else should be fine because they're already in the BCU. No hantavirus, no Andes virus transmission outside there. I don't think there would be anyways, because home symptom monitoring is also fine for that one, even more so than Ebola because it's actually less transmissible, even though it's a respiratory virus. I digress. Casey got a bunch of us together, including Lawrence Gostin, who is a professor and legal scholar at Georgetown University. He directs the O'Neill Institute for Global Health Law. Greg Gonsalves, who is a professor and infectious disease epidemiologist at Yale. Myself, I'm a virologist at the University of Saskatchewan at the Vaccine and Infectious Disease Organization. I'm also the science chair for the Save America movement. And several of our other colleagues are also in the process of signing on. We're putting together an open letter listing essentially all of our objections, our scientific and our legal and our moral objections to this plan, to keeping Americans out of the country in violation of our constitutional rights and actually putting them and all of us at a much higher risk of infectious diseases, at a much higher risk in terms of global health, at a much higher risk in terms of our national security. So we'll see where this goes, but please join us this afternoon at 5 p.m. Eastern, right here. Jessica Malati Rivera and I will be hosting our usual episode of Taking Shots on Friday, and we will have some special guests. We will have Lawrence Gostin joining us to explain some of the legal issues. We will have Krutika Kapali, who is a infectious disease physician. She is formerly with the World Health Organization. She's currently at the University of Texas Southwestern in Dallas. And she is a member of the Infectious Diseases Society of America, which has been really, and she's been a leader in all of this. So she has the perspective of somebody who's actually treated Ebola patients in an Ebola treatment unit and has responded to global health emergencies all over the world, including mostly in Africa. And then finally, we will also have Casey Hickox joining us to talk about her own experience as a nurse in Ebola, in an Ebola outbreak, who came back and had her rights deprived, but at least she was on American soil and also could have been taken immediately to the biocontainment unit at Bellevue Hospital had she ended up testing positive. So her situation was completely unnecessary as well. And it didn't make anybody in America any safer. So please join us today at 5 p.m. I think it's going to be a fantastic conversation. Jessica and I both have deep Ebola experience, and our three guests have so much insight and expertise on this topic. It's going to be a really great discussion. So I hope you join us. I'm going to send out a little thing on all the socials, so you guys will know where to go. Finally, one last thing. I just thought it was worth mentioning. This is something that I had written for my Substack last August when this executive order came out, improving oversight of federal grant making. Now, if you read this thing, it's full of all the usual bullshit about gold standard science. It doesn't really say anything, but what it does say is that it's going to appoint political censors to review NIH grants before they are funded. Now, the normal NIH process up until fascists took over was that your grant would be submitted in one of three cycles. Usually, if you were submitting what's called an R01 grant, that's like a basic NIH 5-year operating grant for your lab. You submit this proposal, and then a study section will meet. That's a panel of peer reviewers, effectively, who have very deep expertise in your field. They're usually selected from people who've gotten these grants within that subject matter area. So they're, definitely, they're not only your peers, like they are experts in this topic. They've had successful NIH grants funded based on their scientific merit. Normally, they get together and they'd evaluate the scientific merit of your grant, the impact, the significance, and how well you supported your hypotheses in your proposal. Well, they're still going to do that. They still have study sections in place, and they've made a big deal about that. Lockdown/podcast Jay Bhattacharya, the NIH director, has said that peer review will always be there, even though he doesn't really like peer review that much. But you know what he also doesn't like? Censorship. And that's what this executive order calls for. Well, unfortunately, my colleague, Elizabeth Genexi, who is a former program officer for NIH. Oops, I thought I had put Liz's article up here and I didn't. Apologies for that. Anyways, I'll just keep mine up there. I have a link on my Substack to it, and I will put a link here. She reported today, and nobody, I think, knows more about the sort of NIH grant environment than somebody like Liz, because she was an NIH program officer for 22 years. So her entire job was making sure that grants were issued according to this science-based process. After study section, normally you would have another study section effectively called the advisory council, and that makes final award decisions based on the study section scores and NIH priorities, or institute priorities, really. So if you're at the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases and somebody submits a cancer grant, you probably nobody's going to do that, but you're probably not going to make that as high of a priority because that's the National Cancer Institute's department. So that's what advisory council would normally do. Advisory council is going to effectively be replaced by a bunch of people who are going to vet reviewed grants for their alignment with Trump administration priorities. So that means gold standard science, which is a standard that's never actually been defined. That means making sure that we're not doing any kind of woke DEI kind of stuff. So don't write any grants about transcription, translation, transitional states, cis and trans molecules, any of these types of things. Will get your grant, canceled because it's too woke or whatever, uses the word trans, uses one of the banned DEI words that Bhattacharya and all of his little lieutenants are trying to extirpate from NIH. So basically, our grant making process is going to be now overseen by political censors. My husband is older than me by about 20 years. And so he did his full college and his PhD in protein biochemistry in the Soviet Union, which is where he's from. And it was actually the Soviet Union at the time. Now, he's not that old. He didn't grow up in Stalin, Lysenko times, but that legacy was still very much in place when he was in graduate school. And let me give you an example. One of the things he did, this was back in the late 80s, so do your homework on the history of protein biochemistry methods, and you will know that it was a big achievement to purify a protein, particularly one that had a major biological impact. He purified the protein activin A, which is a very important developmental regulator. It was a Nature paper. It should have been a first author Nature paper for him. He was a middle author because all of these commissars, the political censors and the political operatives who had been installed throughout academic institutions, scientific institutions throughout the Soviet Union to make sure that nobody was doing any kind of imperialist, capitalist American science, they had to be the first and the senior authors on this paper. And so even though he did all the work, he was the one sitting in the cold room for days with his Ushanka on, purifying these proteins. He was the guy who was going out to the kolkhoz like dairy and coming back with big buckets of cow amniotic fluid to purify this protein out of. He did all that work and he got to be a middle author on his own paper because these censors took precedence. What they're going to do in the US is they are not going to fund research that they think is politically not a priority. That means vaccine research, infectious disease research, cancer research, and really all research, because guess what? Russell Vought, the guy who is the director of the Office of Management and Budget, who engineered this executive order, wants to take all of the NIH budget, all of our health budget, and impound it illegally, reclaim it from being congressionally appropriated as required by the US Constitution, and redirect it to the executive branch to further centralize their dictatorial power and also effectively steal our taxpayer dollars. So that's what we have in store to look for. And I really do want my colleagues in the US, but also abroad, because there are quite a few people, including here in Canada, including at my own institution, who are dependent on NIH funding and who really rely on this. Your grants are not going to get funded anymore because unless you decide that you want to help them do these anti-vax studies, looking at mercury and whatever else, they're not going to fund actual science anymore. And that's what this says. I clocked this back in August when this executive order came out. And I'm going to send the link to Liz Ganexi's page because she really outlines how it all has dropped today in the Federal Register. So something to look forward to. And again, I encourage my academic colleagues to take a look at this. I'm a little bit over the 30 minutes I'm trying to restrict myself to, and I've ranted enough, and I'll see you back here at 5. So please, again, join us for our Taking Shots show with Lawrence Gostin, Krutika Kapali, and Casey Hickox, and me and Jessica Malati Rivera today at 5 p.m. And I will see you maybe tomorrow. I haven't decided if I'm going to do rants on weekends or not. But in any case, be safe, try not to get Ebola, and definitely try to stay out of Ebola prison. Bye, guys.